Susan C. for her rebellious carriage towards her mistress, to be sent to the house of correction and be kept to hard labor and coarse diet, to be brought forth the next lecture day to be publicly corrected, and so to be corrected weekly until the order be given to the contrary. General Court of Connecticut, 1645. Good morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. Today, we are in North Carolina. That's High Falls right over there. I definitely think I may have a calcaneal fracture, which is a minor broken bone in my heel. So I'm not going to move around much for today's video. But I did walk a pretty far way to get here, so it's not that bad. Anyways, we're going to be talking about American history for the next couple days while I go through the Appalachians one last time for the summer. In particular, we recently discussed the Revolutionary War, how it didn't change too much for the lower people on the totem pole, so to speak, economically in the country, even though they did most of the fighting for the revolutionary leaders, and how afterwards things like Shays' Rebellion and other farmer revolts against the financial elite of the time from repossessing their farms caused former revolutionary leaders like Sam Adams to double back, and they began to crush public dissent within the country, even though they had just told people to fight for their freedoms. Now, there are two broad current social movements that occur during the Revolutionary era America, which I define as the time period from the Revolutionary War up until the actual Civil War, which is from roughly 1776 till about 1864. And these two movements are the suffragettes, or feminism, and abolitionists, and then the Indian removal, Native American removal. So today we're going to talk about the abolition and the women's movements some, and I think it's important. I'm definitely way more of a political philosopher than I am a gender or racial rights expert, but I definitely think it's important not to overlook these topics because they were huge trends. So let's remember, whenever the Declaration of Independence was written, only white people, and not just white people, but only white male property owners could vote, and you had to own a certain amount of property. Now, to be fair, that is how the Greeks did it, if, as you guys remember from the stuff we've studied so far. But it's no secret that women and minorities have been marginalized for most of our history, but the extent of marginalization is never more obvious than when you compare how things were in native cultures. So for us, historically, women's primary role has been as a homemaker or child rearer. And personally, I'm kind of like, I don't know whether it's because it's the culture I've been raised in, but that seems natural to me. But there are plenty of examples of tribes, like the Zuni tribes in the southwest of the U.S. that centered their society around women. And the women in the Plains tribes had the right to divorce way before Puritan wives were able to in the U.S. Again, though, that quote that I opened the video with was from the General Court of Connecticut for basically, like, husbands could take their wives during the colonial period. That was the 1640s. A dude could take his wife to court for misbehaving, literally. It like, legally she would be punished, like as if she had done some actual crimes. Now, wives, all the wives out there, you know, you ladies, you definitely need to be behaving, but taking you to court over it, if you act up a little bit, there's other ways to handle that. Anyways, so it was even worse for female slaves. So here's a quote from a slave trader. "I saw a pregnant women give birth to babies while chained to corpses which our drunken overseers had not removed." Hashtag gross, right? 18 married women arrived on the Mayflower, and by the spring only 4 of them were still alive, so they were a little more expendable. And as controversial as it might be, I guess I kind of get that. Like, if you're about to starve, the guys were probably the ones who were doing most of the labor. Could be totally wrong there, but hashtag morbid reality, right? So men had absolute possession of their wife's property, her land, and he was entitled to any income earned by her labor. That was something I did not know until I did the research for this. So I knew women couldn't vote, right? But women couldn't own money. They couldn't earn a wage themselves. And if they did earn money, the money legally belonged to their husbands. They couldn't own property. They were barred from entering college. So, may have gotten married back then, actually. No. I'm sorry. My black humor. Anyways, American history is full of legendary female rebels who stood up against this oppression, though. So there's a lot of inspiring ladies out there, like Anne Hutchinson, who stood up against colonial authority whenever she was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She insisted for the Puritan women that women and ladies could read the Bible for themselves. I guess back then the colonial guys were so busy they didn't realize their ladies learned how to read. She began hosting nightly meetings in Boston, which quickly attracted large crowds of similarly rebellious females. #resist. The church brought her to court on heresy charges and the government for challenging their authority. Unfortunately, this story doesn't have a happy ending. She was expelled from the colony, killed by Indians, and 20 years later, the one person who stood up for her in court, Mary Dyer, will be hanged for, and I quote, rebellion, sedition, and presumptuous attitudes obtruding themselves. So, the conservatism doesn't really begin to describe the attitudes of colonial America. If you were rebelling back then, you were literally putting your lives on the line. There's a ton of other stories, but that's just one to highlight. Now, between the colonial era and the Revolution, not much happens in terms of women's rights. However, the entire era, the closer you are to the frontier, in general, women were treated better because they were more necessary. There weren't as many people out there, and kind of like during wartime, whenever all the dudes get sent away from the country, even back then, for a long time, women has always been important during war, right? However, and again, once the Revolutionary War is underway, women flood out of the woodwork to support the cause. And we see things like the Daughter of Liberty groups. These people urge, like Americans, or these groups of ladies put together canvas campaigns and urge other Americans to support American manufacturers by buying domestic goods, basically supporting the Revolutionary War. Now, unfortunately, at this point in time, only 40% of women were literate in the 1750s, compared with about 90% of men. So we have fewer writings left behind from them. Poor women did enlist in the Revolutionary Army, though, and generally they had more equality on the frontiers due to necessity. We do have some letters left behind from like the upper crust ladies, like John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, who did ask her husband whenever he was about to write the Declaration of Independence, and this is a quote from from Abigail Adams. "In the code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary to make, I desire you would remember the ladies." I'll remember you, ladies. "And be more generous to them than your ancestors." I'll definitely be more generous. So, hey Abigail, #I will. Anyways, after the Revolution, only New Jersey's Constitution ends up granting females the right to vote, and they rescind that right in 1807. So, despite all the lofty language of the Declaration of Independence about men being created equal, well, I guess maybe they just meant it pretty literally. Men were created equal, right? Ladies were not really included politically until they fought for their political rights. So just like today, though, certain professions have always been dominated by girls, like midwifery, nurses, spinstresses, and educators. Back then, kids were kept at home a lot more, and since women were home already, they pretty much had exclusive domain over education. But we do see some movement away from that as industrialization picks up speed. Like in New England, where the textile factories relied heavily on female spinstresses, and we see some of the earliest signs of labor militancy in these mills during the 1830s. So that is a huge trend I want to highlight as we move forward in American history, is the importance of labor rights. Anybody that's working a 40-hour work week today knows how much it sucks, but it's a huge improvement over some of the schedules that these ladies and other industrial workers were being forced to pull back then. They were working in the way that we got our improved 40-hour work weeks was by labor militancy, strikes. People actually stood up and were like, these working conditions are wrong or bad. Ladies organized some strikes in the spinster, like the weaving factories in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Lowell, Massachusetts, Dover, New Hampshire. Now, of course, why were the girls the ones doing this instead of the guys? And I'll tell you why. It's because they got paid half of what the dudes got paid back then. There's still a wage disparity today, and I actually don't know what the exact numbers are off the top of my head, but back then it was way worse. So hashtag I get it. Lots of ladies from the time write about working 12 to 16-hour days, but to be fair, these are the same kind of schedules that children and other adults were working at the time. So there wasn't exactly like a gender bias in the amount of hours worked, but there was a gender bias in pay. Education was also restricted. The reason why only 40% of girls back then could read wasn't because they were dumb. It was because their families and the society told them that they couldn't learn how to, and restricted them from accessing the education they needed to develop those skills. Despite this, though, there are some inspiring ladies out there, like Dr. Harriet Hunt, who became a private physician despite being denied twice by Harvard. Another one is Elizabeth Blackwell, who obtained a medical degree from Geneva College in 1849. These ladies paved the way for a ton of aspiring scientists and other important members of our society today. So one of the most interesting aspects of this era to me is how many women were involved in the abolition movements, even though they did not have full political rights themselves. I guess because they were suffering from some pretty overt oppression back then, it makes sense that they kind of banded together with people that saw the injustices of slavery. Anyways, leading up to the Civil War, we see a nation fraught with social tensions beginning to bubble over. Margaret Fuller wrote, "There exists in the minds of men a tone of feeling towards women as towards slaves." And I think there is some truth to that. Probably the domineering attitudes, really in general, and I believe Aristotle even has some stuff about this that we'll get to eventually, but there is a part of all of mankind that I guess I would say our egos want to control, not just ourselves and our environments, but other people. And that's not what real love is. Real compassion is not controlling. So we can learn a lot from seeing how they overcame these legitimate obstacles, they being like these female freedom fighters that weren't even really that long ago. And we'll finish off talking about what happened with the ladies by discussing one of the most important events of the early feminist movement, which is the convention at Seneca Falls in New York. So this is the first women's rights convention in history, and it's one of the few things I recall learning about in high school, so it must be a big deal, right? Anyways, 300 women end up attending this, and they sign a Declaration of Principles modeled after the Declaration of Independence. Here's a quote from this document. "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of men towards women. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." And then they go on to list a bunch of grievances that are true. So let's see, what were the women getting all uptight about back then? No right to vote, no right to wages, no right to property, no right in divorce cases, no equal employment, no college entrance. Yeah, that kind of sounds sucky, right? Now, I will be honest, I think a lot of times today, the divorce courts are a little biased towards the ladies, but as we can see, they were not always on an equal playing field, right? Anyways, the convention at Seneca Falls sparked a movement that organized abolitionists and suffragettes. So that's one cool outcome. Even though only 300 people appeared at this time, these people began to show up year after year, and they start to organize the networks of people that stand up for rights that help spark both the emancipation of slaves in the United States and the enfranchisement of women. I can't believe I forgot what the word for that. And amidst these events, our national hunger for land and expansion put us on a collision course with the Native Americans. So that is another group that's commonly overlooked and it is not pretty. Tomorrow we'll talk some about this other event, and this isn't forward in history. The women's rights, abolition movement, and us purging the natives, the politically correct term is Indian removal policies, all were occurring roughly at the same time. After the Revolutionary War, but before the Civil War. Then we have the Reconstruction era, which is basically from Civil War up until about World War I. And then we have, like, I guess depending on how you divide it, the modern era is like from World War I till today, or you could go like early modern, World War I to like the 60s, and then the 60s to today. Anyways, this is a wandering author here, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives, guys and girls. As always, my message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your communities today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, I love y'all.